Hello everybody, my name is Boulevard and welcome to Tournament War Room, where I try to keep you up to date on the tournament meta. As a caster, I usually watch at the very least one full tournament start to finish each weekend, and then I like to do breakdowns of the top 16 or top 8 or what have you, and try to make some predictions going forward on what we saw last week, into what we saw this week, and to what we're going to see going forward. And with only 2 weeks left for the seasonal tournament, we're going to have a couple of interesting tournaments to look at next weekend as well, this upcoming weekend rather, but I want to talk about where we went from week 1 to week 2 and how these trends are going to continue going forward. The first thing that I actually want to do is take a look at the regional combination breakdown from the Twin Suns podcast tournament that happened in week 1 versus Duels of Shurima that happened in week 2. Now, Duels of Shurima was about twice as big and it did take place a week later. And you'll notice there are some differences. Targon, exactly the same. Ionia got cut in half. Demacia cut in half. Shurima is about the same. Shadow Isle nearly doubled. Noxus went up a bit, but not a lot. Same with PNZ. Slight fall off of Bilgewater, and Freljord once again remained exactly the same. And the reason for these numbers is, number one, Scouts has completely fallen off a cliff, as has Nightfall. I had kind of moved up Nightfall and Scouts into rank 1, thinking that these mid-range aggro decks were going to be really good if we continue down the path of an aggro format. We have not continued down the path of an aggro format, actually going from about a 50% representation of aggro in the top 8 of the online league series, and I didn't actually math out the aggro representation in Twin Suns, but it was decently high as well, down to a 25% aggro representation in Duels of Shurima. But that said, the lineups are still topping, or rather getting very far in the tournament. It was a win in the online league series for aggro. It was a second place finish in Duels of Shurima for aggro. It's still winning fight nights. It's still winning other smaller weekday tournaments. It's still a very prominent thing, and despite its lack of representation in Top Cut, it is still making it very far in the event or ultimately winning it. I think that is going to continue to decrease next weekend as we see more Aesol Demacia pop up. That was one of the big Demacia decks over here. Shen Demacia also falling off. That's where the big Demacia fall off happens, was Scouts and Shen Demacia kind of fall off. Everybody's now on Aesol Demacia. And as we can see here, 5 Aesol Demacia in Top Cut, 8 Demacia total. It makes sense that that's the main Demacia deck of the format. So the lineup that a lot of players are starting to gravitate towards, if they're not playing triple aggro, for the most part is Aesol Demacia, Lysandra, and then there's no set third deck. A lot of players are just saying, hey, this is my most comfortable deck. It doesn't have bad matchups, or not like egregiously bad matchups into some of the more popular decks. We are going to run that as my third deck, and that's something that I think we're going to continue to see pick up in popularity. Lysandra, probably the best tournament deck. I think I said it last week, I'm going to reiterate this. Lysandra is just probably the best tournament deck. It is definitely the ban for most lineups. Hose is triple aggro. A lot of the mid-range decks don't even deal with it particularly well. And one thing that I actually do want to touch on here, before I get into this too much, is that if you look through my content, I don't talk a whole lot about ban strategy and lineup composition, and I feel like I should be doing that a little bit more, but I've always been pretty honest with you guys about where my weaknesses lie as an analyst, and because a lot of what I'm dealing with is theoretical because I'm casting tournaments and not playing them, my ban strategy might lead you astray. And because there are so many different lineups, here, 22 different decks in Top Cut. It's so hard to talk general broad strokes ban strategy and lineup composition when there are so many different things that you could be seeing. For the most part, I usually recommend what I think is the best lineup, and usually I'm recommending standard. I'm not really one to recommend a counter lineup to you, especially when, we're seeing 5 as the highest represented deck in a top 16. When we were looking at last format in patch 2.4, where 13 of a top 16 was TF Fizz, I mentioned that the benchmarks that I was happy with was, I feel like if anything is consistently taking more than half of any given top cut, that deck is a problem in tournaments. And we haven't had anything come close to that. Once again, this was a top 16 tournament, so Scouts nowhere near the 8 representation halfway mark. These decks all took up 4. Lysandra's really the only one that's been hovering near half, but even that's 5 out of 16, 3 out of 8, 5 out of 16. It's not showing oppressive numbers. And there is a lot of sort of wiggle room that you have in the format. You don't have to play Lysandra. If this deck is going to be consistently banned, you can just run 3 comfort decks. Now, what the Lysandra Aesol lineup does give to you is a very solid foundation for beating any aggro player that you run into. Lysandra does very well against the 1-drops aggros and things of that nature. You have a lot of board wipes that really aren't costing you anything. You have a lot of spell life gain through Blighted Ravine and Withering Wail and Vile Feast and Kindly Tavern Keeper and all that kind of stuff. Aesol Demacia just has probably the most unit healing in the game. You've got Fangs, people are playing Sunforger, Star Shaping, Guiding Touch sometimes. There's an insane amount of healing, and the 1-drop decks are starting to fall off a little bit more because they gas out. something like Discard coming up as the most popular aggro deck of the weekend was pretty surprising. As I had mentioned, only 25% of the top 16 was aggro. For those of you that can do math, that means there were 4 aggro lineups in top 16, and there were 5 discard decks. This is something that people are just splashing as their third comfort deck and saying, hey, this will probably do pretty well against some of the things. You do still need to ban Lysandra. The 1 damage board wipes do a lot in making sure that discard loses its footing because their big power play is a crowd favorite on turn 4, and it's really easy for them to actually get 5 units down in the first 3 turns and get a 7/6 crowd favorite down. And you know, TF red card, really not in the meta too much anymore, and I think that's where discard gets some time to shine. Aesol Demacia, not dealing with wide boards particularly well. The more Targon you see, the more discard you're going to see, right? Because Targon doesn't have the removal tools necessary to deal with Jinx, to deal with crowd favorite. Like, you can hush the crowd favorite, but there are other things that you would also probably need to hush, since your best way of removing a Jinx is hushing the quick attack away from it and dealing with it in combat. So while in previous weeks I had mentioned that I thought that Nightfall and Scouts were going to be the premier aggro decks, I do think that it makes a lot of sense that Discard is making more of the rise, just being a good anti-Targon deck. And there's no set formula for, once you've got your Lysandra and Aesol Demacia, what is your third deck? Personally, I like running double Targon with Lysandra, and one of the big things about that I think a lot of players are starting to realize, and this will be a big pressure point for the seasonal, Aesol Demacia is typically a Zoe deck, and if you've played the deck, let's say 10 games, and you've opened Zoe on one in a decent number of those games, you are probably going to come to a similar conclusion that I did over the course of a couple of games, and that is that this is probably the worst Zoe deck we've ever had. Zoe feels like she was kind of haphazardly splashed in there because she was broken, and while I was playing the deck, I was often finding myself attacking to reduce the cost of my super cool star chart more than I was attacking to generate a super cool star chart. We've seen some players experiment with their champion lineup and go like 3 Zoe, 2 Aurelion Soul, and like 1 Jarvan or 1 Lux or something like that. I think that as we get closer to the seasonal, you need to accept that Aesol Demacia mirrors are going to be very prevalent, and 3 Aesol probably will become the standard. Now, the question is Zoe. Do we have to run Zoe? Can we run something else? Shyvana is probably the most common secondary champion, just because, she does get a little bit out of hand if you don't deal with her. She's not going to win you any games per se, but she is a threat that your opponent must answer, and she's pretty good into something like Lysandra, but I think that if you are running an Aesol Demacia deck, you are probably still banning Lysandra decks. Spirit's Journey is a big tech that Lysandra is having for anti-Targon matchups, and a lot of players are starting to put that in. We'll go over the adaptations of Lysandra probably in Tournament Tactician. For now, I want to focus on what we're focusing on here, and that is that Zoe is by no means necessary, a mandatory inclusion in Aesol Demacia. So personally, I think right now probably my favorite lineup is the Zoe, Diana, Shadow Isle Invoke, Lysandra, and Aesol Demacia. And if I'm running Shyvana, then I still have my Zoe, Diana free for the Invoke deck. And overall, I think that this is like a super solid lineup that covers a lot of bases. I'm very happy with how this is positioned in the meta, and we actually saw What Am I pick up a win in Duels of Shurima with a similar lineup, but instead of the Aesol Demacia, actually did go for Go Hard, and I thought that Go Hard was going to start to pick up some prominence into the seasonal. I'd mentioned that on Tournament Tactician. It was sort of like my underrated deck of the format. Draven Ezreal was my week 1 underrated deck of the format. It started to pick up play. I played it a lot. Remembered I hated this deck. Go Hard is starting to do the same thing, where I was like, this is my underrated deck. I started playing it again. I remembered I hated it, but we'll see. At the very least, I am on a weekly basis being able to pick out one deck that is probably a little bit underrepresented, and we are seeing players start to figure out the Go Hard build. It's still a triple champion split, so we'll see if that does get cleaned up, because right now it is 2 TF, 2 Elise, and 2 Gangplank, going for the Dreadway Ladros finisher, and ultimately I'm pretty happy with how the deck is positioned in the meta, but I'm not in love with its power level, especially if you are going against, something like a double Targon and Lysandra lineup, because I think that we ended up playing against triple aggro in the finals. I don't remember how the top 16 bracket actually played out for What Am I, if he did run into other aggro decks in there, or if he had to out mid-range them, and it is possible. There's really not that much Dreadway removal in the format, and Dreadway Pack Your Bags is sort of just the new Ladros Pack Your Bags. It'll do, 10 damage instead of the 15 that the Ladros Pack did, but it's still a very nice tool. And I am very curious to see how we actually adapt this Go Hard deck going forward. So now that I've basically just been nonsensical ranting for about 9 minutes, let me try and hone in a little bit here on what I'm actually trying to get at. So, Lysandra, Aesol Demacia, definitely the 2 most popular decks of the format. That's been pretty consistent across the board. They've been up there at the very least. This is where players started to discover Aesol Demacia. It was even the only Demacia deck in the OLS. It's now getting a really good representation in top cuts, sort of mimicking Lysandra in terms of that, and I think that is going to continue exponentially going forward. These will definitely be 2 of the top 5 decks in the seasonal, 100% for the top 32. You will see a lot of Lysandra and you will see a lot of Ace Demacia. And I do think that Zoe should probably not be in this deck. Or at the very least, you know, if you're not running a different Targon deck, Zoe's fine. The Zoe is probably a little bit better than Shyvana, but Shyvana is not so much worse than Zoe that you can't swap it out and put a different Zoe deck in your lineup, namely either Invoke or Lee Sin. Lee Sin is sitting pretty stagnantly here, you know, maintaining a pretty decent presence, you know, tying with Lysandra here, being one of the most popular decks here, and then just kind of continuing to fall off. And I think part of that is just players not really wanting to cut the Zoe just yet. So if I had to talk top 5 decks going into the seasonal, Lee Sin definitely going to be in the top 5, but I would imagine it'll be in the number 4 or 5 spot. You really have to want to run Lee Sin. This is not a deck that players are really super jived about. And, you know, I think I was talking to Doza about it on a cast, and I was saying Lee Sin doesn't feel like a super strong deck right now. It feels like it's got some bad matchups. It's one of the more exploitable decks by aggro, which is why we usually see it in like a middle of the road style of representation. But if a time traveler came back 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now, whenever the seasonal finals is, and said, hey, Boulevard, Lee Sin won the seasonal, I would not be surprised in the slightest. Now, as for the other decks that we're going to get in the top 5, you know, I think something like Draven Ezreal will probably be in the top 10. TF Fizz, not going to be in the top 10. Spiders, whatever. So what we're really trying to figure out here is what are the 3 and 4 slots for topping the seasonal. Discard had a good showing here, and while I do think it is a good anti-Targon deck, I don't think that we're going to be seeing a lot of double Targon, and players aren't really quickly adapting to the fact that Zoe probably shouldn't be in this deck. You would have expected, you know, over the course of the week, we kind of figured that out and nobody did, so I don't know if we're going to drop the Zoe by the time the seasonal comes, or, you know, just whatever comfort decks we end up playing. It's possible that Lee Sin is even number 3, just because these 2 decks are so popular, and then the third comfort deck is just a scattered hodgepodge, whatever the players feel like running, and we don't really, you know, have a cohesive top 8 we're going to have, or top 10 or top 5 champion list, rather. We're just going to have something like this where we've got 22 different decks in Top Cut with an insane amount of 1-ofs because, you know, oh, I ran Lysandra, Demacia, and Pirates, and I run Lysandra, Demacia, and Nasus, and you get what I'm going in here. So Lee Sin, definitely think that that is going to be like the number 5 deck, and we got to figure out what's going to sit here in the middle, and we also have to figure out what aggro is actually going to do in terms of the seasonal. I am not optimistic for 1-drop aggro like Spiders and Pirates. They usually tend to do pretty well in the Swiss rounds, and they'll make it to the top 32. I know aggro is always like a big pressure point when players do their tournament prep, and they you know, spend hours thinking about their lineup, and they go, hey, you know, actually, I lose to triple aggro. That's not a great look. I think that Lysandra and Ace Demacia do beat aggro so organically that the only real thing that you need to do is make sure that your last deck doesn't get bodied by Spiders and Pirates. And that does take a couple of things off the table for you. I think it's one of the reasons that TF Fizz is still maintaining a super low representation while it is still in there. You know, TF Fizz struggled with aggro in the past, and while it wasn't a consistent counter to it, with TF Fizz not having as much finishing power as it did previously, I do think that it, you know, it just does do a little bit worse against aggro. You're not racing them as efficiently with 2-1 Burblefish as you were with, you know, 3-1 Burblefish and 4-2 Burblefish. Draven Ezreal, I still think, is in like a pretty fine position. It's nice anti-aggro. It'll blow things out like Frostbite mid-range, which has had a really randomly large resurgence in the LRA. Not totally sure how much stake to put in that because it actually wasn't Riot format as we found out, but, you know, whatever, that's a story for another time. I do think that Invoke will be top 10, but not top 5. Players usually aren't big on Invoke. It's one of those Lee Sin style decks where it's very preferential. Like, you kind of really need to want to run this. And Invoke is a little bit harder to play than Lee Sin because you have so many different options available to you. A lot of Lee Sin games will play out the same. Invoke is one of those things where every game feels different because your choices offered up on your invokes come at different times, or especially something like Mountain Scryer having the entire pool available for you can really change the way that any given game plays out. So I understand why Invoke isn't super popular, but it is a deck that I like a lot and that I value very highly in power level. So now Nasus is kind of an interesting one as well. This deck has been really popular on the Master Ladder in Europe. It's been the most popular deck up there for a couple of days now. I think sitting at like an 11 or 12% play rate in Masters specifically, not Plat Plus. And Draven Ezreal sitting not too far behind it, and it's been maintaining a decent win rate of about 52 to 55%. I think this deck sucks. I still think it's missing something. I've been shit-talking this deck for a while. I'm going to continue to shit-talk the deck going into the seasonal, and if I end up eating my words, you know, it's not going to be the first time, but it is one of the times where I really want to like nail home that I think this deck is a bait. And if I have to eat my words, you know, I will. but I do think that this deck is a bit of a bait. It's really good against aggro. It doesn't do super well against double Targon, and I really am preaching double Targon. And that's not because I think, you know, Nasus is a good deck that we need to respect by double Targon. I just think that, like, Targon is the best region in the game, right? Like, it's been showing a consistently high representation. Shadow Isle actually overtook it as the most popular region here. Noxus even getting up there as well. And this is another thing that I wanted to point out. Noxus and Shadow Isle are like the two aggro regions. We're not really seeing an insane amount of aggro, so how are these still sitting so high? Shadow Isle, obviously, Lysandra is going to play into that, as well as the aggro decks that we are seeing. Shadow Isle probably going to continue to be one of the more popular regions out there, but because it's aggro versus hard control, and even some weird mid-range decks or mid-gamey style decks like Nasus, Invoke, once again, that's another Shadow Isle deck that we're seeing in there. So things are just getting a little out of hand there. The high presence of Noxus actually does surprise me. Draven Ezreal and Discard Aggro are the main Noxus decks that we're seeing, as well as Spiders. So it makes sense that it's high. I would expect Noxus to go down, but I would expect Targon to maintain its presence here. Players just really aren't on double Targon. You know, as much as I like it, as much as I like to preach it and say, hey, I think this is really good, it's not something that we're seeing players really adapt to and want to bring out, instead just going for their comfort decks. Draven Ezreal is a big comfort deck for a lot of players. But once again, I think that Draven Ezreal is... I don't like it, but I think it's good. Nasus, I don't like, and I think it's a bait. And that's sort of the difference here, is that I sometimes I can tell when my bias is playing against me, right? I can tell that Draven Ezreal is better than I give it credit for in a lot of situations. I don't know. There's something about me in this deck that don't click. Nasus I want to like, and I just don't, and I think it is a bait. Shen Demacia is another really cool deck going in here, where we've got Mono Shen, we've got Shen J4. I think that those are the two best versions of Shen Demacia. I think that Shen Fiora and Shen Lulu are a lot worse. And I think that, I mean, I prefer Shen J4, but I definitely see the power in Shen Demacia. The main difference is that you're trading out Jarvan IV for Cytherea the Bold, so it's a matter of which of those two cards do you think is better. I really like the utility provided by a level Jarvan, and even just J3 is a super powerful follow-up to a J4 turn, so that's what really sells me on the J4. Go hard, you know, continuing to pretty much stay where it is. I think that it's going to do a little bit better, but Deep is so hard to talk about from an analytical standpoint, because the deck is obviously good, and we're seeing a lot of different builds, and that's one of the reasons it's so hard to talk about. Is I look at two Deep builds and they look nothing alike. You know, we've still got the typical Maokai Nautilus Slaughter Docs full suite of Shadow Isle removal, and then we're seeing like Mono Nautilus, no landmarks, I only play Jettison, Stalking Shadows, Atrocity, and Salvage, and that's my whole spell lineup, and I'll even main deck Beast from Below and things like that. So Deep is still all over the place. I think it's a really solid lineup, but it's one of the decks that I kind of avoid talking about, because if you want to run Deep, you probably have a better idea of what kind of Deep you want to be running than I do, and how that's going to fit into your lineup composition. Now, I know I wanted to talk about, let me bring this back here. This video is all over the place. I do appreciate you bearing with me as I just sort of ramble and word vomit all over my Tuesday wrap-up. But since I talked about Draven Ezreal sort of being like, you know, and Go Hard being like these decks that I thought were underrated, let me talk about Noxus Azir real quick. And this is probably where my wrap-up is going to end, since I did show you the information I needed to and then rambled for 20 minutes. Noxus Azir, I think, is the underrated aggro deck right now. I think that Spiders isn't doing particularly well. Pirates, I think, is probably my pick for, like, worst aggro deck right now. The 12 1-drops, you guys know I've never been a fan of 12 1-drop aggro. And I think that Noxus Azir does, like, scale into the mid-game well enough with Ruin Runner and with things like Darius, or even if you want to put the Draven in here, because the Noxus Azir that topped this was just 3 Azir and 1 Darius. You know, you can afford to kind of mix and match things. We're even seeing Captain Farron in there again. I still think that Noxian Fervor does a lot of good in sort of dodging lifesteal if your Ace Demacia player just doesn't have their single combat or whatever, or they're not really super focused on the lifesteal aspect, because as we get more towards this, we get more focused in on the meta of Lysandra and Ace Demacia being the best decks. You need to build your Ace Demacia deck for the mirror, and there are a lot of anti-aggro cards that aren't good in the mirror. For example, Solari Sunforger, it can test Screeching Dragon, but outside of that, the lifesteal is really not doing anything for you. I really like Radiant Guardian in the deck, but for the most part, you can get away with just 3 Fangs, and that'll be enough for most aggro matchups. So as these players start to move away from the super anti-aggro style of Ace Demacia and more towards a mirror-focused one, because they are going to have to play the mirror a lot, you can start to build back into the gameplay with these more mid-range style aggro decks and not get blown out by a massive swing of lifesteal of your opponent. And I really like the way that these Overwhelm-ish decks are positioned. Not so much Shurima Freljord Overwhelm, because it doesn't have as much of an early game as the Noxus version does. Overwhelm really, I mean, like, you play 1 3-drop and it's not an Overwhelm unit. You play 2 2-drops, one of them's an Overwhelm unit. You play God, please don't play Omen Hawk in this deck. It's not going to do you well going into, sort of going forward. It's fine. Like, if you want to run Omen Hawk, you can. I've never been a super big fan of the card, so I'm going to advocate against it. But I do think that just a better Ruin Runner deck with a little bit more of an early game is what we're looking at in Noxus Azir. And it's been performing pretty admirably. I think it even showed up in the top 8 of OLS, and I think it got, like, top 4. It was going the distance. It didn't win, but I think that every time I see this deck pop up, I like it a little bit more. It's topped every tournament so far as a one of, and I definitely think that this is sort of my pick for underrated aggro deck. Now, that's coming from a place of pure theory. I haven't played the deck. I'm not really an aggro player, so, just kind of looking at it is where I'm getting this implication that I think it's good. It's been banned a lot, so we haven't even gotten to see it, but yeah, that is the note I want to end on here. I think that Noxus Azir is sort of the underrated aggro deck that I would use to round out my lineup if I were playing aggro. But yeah, this is what we've been seeing. These are the regional combinations we've been seeing and the trends that we continue onward. I think that Demacia is going to continue to maintain a pretty high presence. Targon, of course, will still be really up there, as well as there's a lot of random one-off Targon decks. Demacia, really solid. Shadow Isle, absolutely the king. Noxus, I expect to fall off a little bit going forward, and then everything else just kind of is what it is. But yeah, that is my analysis of what we saw over the course of Duels of Shurima.